Arguably, the best thing about working at the Robert Schuman Centre is that it's the only place I've ever worked where everyone I work with is smarter than me. And I have to admit, that is the most exciting experience in my entire life. Some of the people, though, are so much smarter than me that I have to have help in introducing them. And there's just no way that I could do justice to the tremendous accomplishments of Adrienne Héritier. So I had to get someone just as awesome to do the introductory remarks. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Liesbeth Hoge, who is going to introduce Adrienne, and then we'll have our keynote speech, and I'll just play sort of cruise director in moderating the conversation. So Liesbeth.
Thank you, Erik. I can't even compliment you in saying you're the smartest director I've ever had, because it seems like a compliment to myself. So, but you are, very gracious and smart and a great director. And it's a real pleasure here, a very special pleasure, to introduce Professor Adrienne Héritier as a keynote speaker at the opening of the joint sessions of workshops on occasion of the Robert Schuman Centre's 30th anniversary. Now, for many of us, Adrienne needs no introduction, and I could dispense with this, because she's most likely the EUI's most treasured long-time researcher, mentor, colleague, and friend. Adrienne took up a chair here at SPS in 1995, and she's graced her with her presence on and off ever since. However, for the many visitors in the audience, some of you here for the first time, I think it seems fitting to provide some background, which I will proceed to do. Adrienne Héritier is an outstanding scholar of public policy and administration in Europe. She has received many honors, including her election as member of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and as member of the Academia Europaea. In 1994, she received the prestigious Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize, and in 2019, the Endres Prize by the Hertie School for her research bridging policy and scholarship. She was also chair of the European Union Studies Association. Your CV doesn't mention when, but I'm guessing it's between 2009 and 2011. Born in Switzerland, Adrienne Héritier obtained her doctorate at the University of Gießen and her habilitation at the University of Münster. After professorial stints at Konstanz and Bielefeld, she held a chair in public policy here at the EUI from 95 to 99. She then took up a directorship of the Max Planck Institute in Bonn until 2003. But can you blame her? Tuscany was beckoning. And in 2003, indeed, she accepted a joint chair with SPS and the Robert Schuman Centre, which she occupied till her retirement a few years ago. I said retirement, I actually meant to say formal retirement, because Adrienne continues to publish, lead research teams, and critique the work of others. Professor Héritier's work focuses on European policymaking, comparative public policy, European decision-making, and theories of institutional change. In each of these fields, she has left an indelible mark. I can only name a few themes, because you really want to hear her keynote, not me, in which she has been particularly inspirational, so I'll limit it to 3. One is her work on new modes of governance, a concept she originated. Observing policymaking in the EU, she notes an anomaly. The EU is able to create common goods, even though effective statehood, authoritative coercive state power that we associate with national states, is largely absent. Adrienne, often in fruitful collaboration with PhD researchers and postdocs, identifies, empirically traces, and explains how not one, but several different modes of governance can exist. And this work has spilled beyond the EU, because it has motivated new ways of conceiving public policy making across Western societies. Adrienne developed a rationalist institutionalist theory of institutional change. I focus on that second contribution. And in this, she draws attention to the interstitial change that emerges between formal treaty revisions. And this is Héritier's effective challenge to treaty-based liberal intergovernmentalism. Noteworthy here is her work on the co-decision procedure and her single-authored Oxford book explaining institutional change. And finally, let me highlight Adrienne's big picture thinking in her most recent work. This is her endeavor to answer the key question, Quo vadis Europe? To borrow the title of the lecture that Adrienne gave at the Hertie School in 2019. In this work, she weighs the pros and cons of how the EU could balance three basic properties of good governance: democratic legitimacy, public policy effectiveness, and institutional flexibility. This is also close to the big picture topic that Adrienne will address today. The title of her talk, you have it here, Federalization versus Sovereignty, Federalization and Sovereignty, correction, countervailing forces in the European Union. Adrienne, thank you for agreeing to give the keynote today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. When Erik asked me what I should talk about, or I asked him what I should talk about, he said, whatever you want to. So I looked at the program of the ECPR conference, workshops, and I thought, oh wow, it's so broad, it's so vast. So I'm just going to do what is closest to my heart. And that's the European Union and how it works. And I would like to focus on this kind of constant challenge with which the EU is confronted when it has to face these countervailing forces of kind of a pressure to deal with collective tasks, important, urgent collective tasks on the one hand, and react to kind of wishes of member states and actors in member states to preserve political latitude to shape policies at the European level. I think this is part of the DNA of the European Union, with which we are living and have to live also in the future. And this kind of tension and how it plays out, I would like to focus on in this talk. So I will describe first a few process challenges which are not entirely new, but it throws a typical light of how political processes are confronted with in view of this tension. Then on policy challenges with which the EU is confronted and it has to deal with, and wanting to do so considering institutional change, actually mostly uploading of competencies to the European level, but this kind of road is difficult to proceed on because of the unanimity rule and consensus rule which prevails. So what you can observe very often in the last decades, again and again and again, is a form of covert institutional change, and indeed covert or hidden policy changes which have led to a deepening integration without including the public arenas, actually more at beknownst of the citizens of the European Union. This can cause some backlash of citizens in the European Union when they ask, well, how did we get here? How did we get to this degree of deepened integration without our being aware of it? So the question then, which I will raise, is how can one react to this unease in view of deepening integration, which has happened in a more covert form, and what are possible solution perspectives, in particular, considering the new geopolitical situation we find ourselves in, and kind of the expectations of further enlargement of the European Union. So, So, as you know, the process challenges in the European Union every day, day by day. You have this tension in decision-making, in political decision-making and policy shaping, which is, as you know, problem definition, agenda setting, the formal political decisions, the implementation of formal decisions, and then a feedback loop through the electoral cycle to what has been decided at the European level. And of course, you also always find here kind of a gap between what the national preferences are for what the policies are required and what then the European Union comes up with policy solutions which maybe differ from what the national electorates expected in the voting process. So you have this need to cooperate on the one hand, given very pronounced collective problems which we are facing, and the need for collective action on the one side, and on the other side, then the issue after issue, you have to kind of construct a consensus, demanding questions based on dialogue, conflict, mutual distrust, mutual trust, which is then subject to bargaining, also deliberation to some extent, in the context of the existing institutional rules. And this process is slow. It's not a fast process, it's a slow process. And sometimes it creates a lot of discontent, a reaction of polarization in the citizenship, in the electorate, which may be exploited by radical leaders, political leaders, if it is not attenuated by democratic decision-making processes, and in particular by the role of political parties with an inward and external pluralism, in the sense of having within the political group different subgroups which can engage in conflict and in negotiation and decisions on the one side, and of course, a number of competing parties externally. Now, vis-à-vis, what you find then in this process, given this tension, you find a pronounced conflict of loyalties, which is constantly there. It's there of national actors vis-à-vis their national electorate, but also at the same time vis-à-vis the national actors, governments, vis-à-vis their colleagues at the horizontal level. And the bigger the difference is between the preferences of majority of national electorates on the one side, just thinking that there are on average like 5 to 7 national elections per year in the European Union, in member states, and the preferences of the majorities in the member states, and the fact that in many decision-making processes you have to use unanimity rule or qualified majority rule, or de facto what is used very often consensus rules. No wonder, given all these conditions, that decision-making process is slow and the European motor, as has been described frequently, starts stuttering. Now, what it also produces is a kind of an inconsistent behavior which you can observe between the two levels. On the one side, for instance, given an Italian example, that the former government has signed the European Stability Mechanism, and then the following present government did not ratify it, under the impression of an unpopular being unpopular in public opinion in Italy, Or another very recent example, that the Italian government has confirmed the reformed Stability and Growth Pact, but at the same time, a large number of Italian MEPs in the European Parliament have not voted for that reformed Stability and Growth Pact. But at the same time, of course, the inconsistency you also find on the part of citizens. Citizens which, as we have seen in the past now, parliamentary elections, discuss national issues in the course of the campaigns for the European Parliament, but then are very surprised if at the European level, these kind of decision preferences at the national level are not reflected, are not kind of clearly reflected in the decisions making of at the European level, where the rationale and the logics of coming to majority decisions functions very differently, where majorities have to be put together by different political groups, issue by issue by issue. Now, another kind of interesting horizontal transborder politicization is a kind of a challenge which has developed in European policymaking and European politics in general, is that national governments and national political actors react to what's happening in other member states. They don't do it directly. They would comment on what other member states are doing in particular policy issues, in budgetary behavior, through the legacy media, but also on social media, of course, which meant that what emerged is a kind of a public transnational political space alongside the formal arenas of the European Council, the European Parliament, and the European Commission. They're, for instance, on movements, social movements, which are, for instance, the Gilets jaunes or the farmers' protests, more recently now during the kind of the entire green package, which is being discussed at the European level. And this kind of intermediate political sphere, which, as Maurizio Ferreira has called it, is very important. And if you are a leader in one of the member states, if you don't engage in this kind of informal political exchange indirect between national leaders, you can't really take influence on what's decided at the European level. So you have to engage with this kind of intermediate political sphere by different means, by bilateral talks, by meeting up with other leaders, etc., and informal alliances, which you find quite often, let's say, the southern member states, the northern member states, etc., etc. But this sphere plays an important role in shaping policy decisions and influencing politics at the European level. Now, another, of course, perpetual challenge with which European decision makers, but not only European decision makers, of course, are faced is the kind of double challenge between responsiveness on the one hand and responsibility on the other hand. So political leaders are between these two expectations. Shall I be responsive to my voters, what their public opinion in my member state says? Should I respond to that? Or should I kind of what has been called demand orientation of political leaders, or has been criticized as a kind of paying a price for supportive public opinion for political support, which also has been called output democratic legitimation or consumer democracy critically, along the lines of the models of Schumpeter and Downs, where policies is a market of products which you sell, right? But not so much kind of emphasizing political processes as such in the European Union. And on the side, of course, each political leader in the European Union at the national level has to face the question of what is responsible behavior. as opposed to, Peter Mayer defined it as following the European rules, but I find that in a too formal definition. I think substantively it actually means to be oriented towards and interested in midterm developments, policies and actions to be taken, and long-term measures to be taken in the interest of future generations and in view of the common good of the entire European Union. And well, what I think actually faced with these different process challenges, what is very important, and maybe I personally myself underestimated a bit in the past, is that it's extremely important that you have well-functioning political parties at the EU level, which, as has been said by Jan Werner Müller, represent the EU to society, to itself, give an image of what they see, how they consider the EU, its interests, preferences, identities, and values. And very importantly, political groups kind of using their processes in order to socialize citizens into democratic decision-making. Conflict, bearing conflict, negotiating over conflicts, finding compromises, finding joint solutions. And of course, here again, the precondition is, as I said earlier, internal plurality of having kind of competing interests within one party, but also, of course, having competing other parties in the European Union as such, at the European level, and of course at the national level. And that, of course, is very particularly important because it's so different what parties can do as compared to social media. Because in the social media, to the extent to my limited knowledge, I have to say, there is no kind of full discussions going on, no conflict, bargaining, finding solutions, coming to compromises, and taking decisions. It's kind of open-ended, but you can leave off steam, right? And kind of in the public sphere and ventilate this, your anger or your enthusiasm, whatever it is. And, but of course, to say what the social media are very fast, and decision-making and negotiating and deciding within political parties is a slow process. So you have a slow process on the one hand, and you have a fast process on the other hand, which of course makes it even more difficult that political parties do function in view of this high-speed competition of social media, but with often problematic consequences. So going now to the policy challenges, which are, as I said earlier, clearly between huge collective tasks we are faced with, and on the one hand, and with the wish of member states and having the conviction that they know actually best what would be the solution for many problems in the member state context, because they have local knowledge, because they have local expertise, but at the same time pressed by the urgent need to take into account collective policy action in areas such as security, defense, climate policy, energy, migration, social policies. You are in this tension. And one way, of course, was always to say, well, then we have to change the treaties. But as you all know, for a considerable length of time, there have been no treaty changes, and political actors are very hesitant to invest political capital into changes of treaties. So there is a certain fear to say, if we open up this box, there will be so many, I'll say it very brutally, we open a can of worms, and so many solutions come up, so many conflicts, such a casino, that it will be very difficult to kind of tame this discussion and come to, within a short period of time, to solutions which help to solve these collective action problems which we are facing. So the path to a redistribution of competencies, uploading them to the federal level, has not really been used, has not happened. And what did happen, and I've been actually observing over a length of time, because of the high decision threshold, unanimity rule, referenda which have to be taken in member states after a treaty change, or have to be confirmed by constitutional courts. What has happened in that context, given that this kind of route is barred, you can't use it, a lot of kind of creative treaty change has emerged, which has cut corners, has gone around possibilities, has tried to use paths which are not explicitly formal, actually, to change the de facto functioning of the treaties. Faced with these tasks, collective tasks on the one side, and the wish for kind of having still political latitude at the member state level, Fritz Schaaf has talked about a typical feature of the European Union in the recent years, under-integration of collective tasks and over-integration through market integration, with, at the same time, as was his classical argument, limited collective power to correct the negative external effects of market integration, because in the Council you need a political majority to correct these kind of negative external effects of market integration. And due to the diverse preferences of member states, it has been very difficult, and the high consensus requirements under the community method and in the Council, it was very difficult to come about with changes which led to a certain economic over-integration during the euro crisis, leading to a crisis of export-oriented economies and deepening divide between northern and southern member states. And the famous austerity policy advocated by the northern member states, hated by the southern member states, and at the same time, of course, also along the lines of the judicial system, over-constitutionalization, given the fact that a lot of court decisions and the case decisions have become part of the treaty texts. So what is in the European treaties is actually much more than is usually in a national constitution, where you have procedural rules as how the processes have to be conducted, but you have very kind of detailed also aspects within the treaties relating to court rulings regarding the functioning of the integrated market, which led to what has been called then over-constitutionalization, which means that a lot of action capacity of member states has been reduced through given court rulings, which don't allow full action or action at the member state level of policies which could be conflicting with some ECJ ruling which is in the treaties. And so that would mean that there have been proposals now, quite drastic proposals, particularly by Dieter Grimm, but also by Schaaf, but also others, to kind of try to take issues out of the treaties which have nothing to do really with procedural rules of a polity such as the EU. Now, how are we doing time-wise? Can you tell me? Time-wise?
You've got 10 more minutes.
Great, yeah. And since we have the pressing need of action because of the emergencies which we are facing, which you are all aware of, and the high threshold of uploading competencies to the EU level, we have have been testimonies to this hidden deepening integration. We had what has been called treaty change without treaty change, which has happened through, for instance, the Passerelle, Article 122, enhanced cooperation, but very often through this kind of fact that because member states can't agree on particular decisions, they come up with rather fuzzy decisions which allow for interpretation by other actors, which very often are then actors which are kind of non-majoritarian actors, that is, are agencies, which have more kind of supranational preferences, and in a second step they can these vague policy decisions or institutional rules reinterpret in the sense of a deepening integration, which has happened frequently, which then de facto changes the kind of treaty reality in the European Union. And what has happened very frequently, what you have seen in many areas which are technically complex, is that the actors just would say, if you don't like the politicians, go technical. And then they won't interfere anymore. They will just have to accept the expertise of actors with the expertise knowledge. But, of course, and what you also have seen, just to mention a few other kind of these hidden ways how to really obtain a change of the treaties and political policy rules, but also institutional rules, has been kind of just going out of the community method in order to come up with important measures such as the European Stability Mechanism. It was kind of went outside of the treaty, is an intergovernmental agreement in order to avoid a veto of, it was Brexit, it was still Britain at that time, but it was also other member states, present member states, and which have kind of then led to the kind of an exit of the treaty in order to realize things which otherwise would have been met with a veto power of one or several actors. What you also can observe, which is a very hidden kind of strategy, is that there are certain transversal policies, like for instance state subsidies, which has been shown, for instance, by Michael Blauberger, that the Commission, through kind of judging which state subsidies are should be accepted or not, they consider and control actually all policies in a member state. They say, okay, that type of policy action would be worth a state subsidy, which means that in a way the EC, the Commission, has taken the competence of influencing member states' policies, although in areas in which it has no competencies at all. So this is a very hidden way of kind of interfering and shaping national policies through a transversal rule like state subsidy rule, or also, of course, another example is the national action plans in the context of the Stability and Growth Pact, which has to be, of course, accepted by the Commission. And the Commission has kind of shifted it out of the area of the European Parliament, and it's now under kind of under the Commission control, which means, of course, that it has much more influence, the Commission, than particularly the European Parliament, for instance. And another kind of form of having a hidden form of widening European regulation has been to have parallel regulations with member states, which member states can choose from. But member states usually choose then the European regulation because then they have less adoption costs if they have to deal across member states with regulatory questions. Now, the thing is, of course, that a lot of hidden and deepening integration has happened. And the problem is that at one point or another, which sometimes then came out in referenda at the national levels, citizens would realize that, oh, actually integration has gone much farther than I expected it to, or that I knew, was aware of. We don't like this. So there may be a backlash against this type of hidden deepening integration. So, and that would play into the hands of populist leaders. What could be done in this situation? I think strengthening the European Parliament would certainly be one way to go. Stronger links between the European Parliament and national parliaments, and an input from national parliaments into EC decision-making in at least consultative way. But as I have to repeat it again, what would be very important is a strong role of European parties, socializing into conflict and compromise, considering the social media competition. What has also been observed now recently, that there is a politicization of independent regulatory authorities which react to this kind of independence and expertise governed independent regulatory authorities, saying, no, 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 the European Parliament should have much more of a role here, and they should report regularly to the European public on what they are doing, etc., etc. And then, of course, you have seen this entire development in the context on the conference on the future of Europe, where it has been proposed this consultative citizen policy planning platforms which are linked to the policy programs planned by the Commission. So there are all kinds of proposals out there. So in the first conclusion, one could say that given the diversity of member states and the very likely increasing diversity of member states, considering future enlargements in the context of the pressing situation, geopolitical situation, and the need of a permanent balancing of forces of federalization and sovereignty at the same time, you will probably find more and more often, which has been shown also in a big project here, research project at the Schuman Centre, more differentiation and more flexibility in the EU. And at the same time also the need of bundling forces and creating common action capacity for fast reactions to external and internal shocks. That is the classical collective action problems in defense, security, foreign policy, energy transition, fiscal policy, social policy, migration. So what you find now on the side of how could flexibility be enhanced, at the same time also collective action capacity, what has been proposed by Scharf is that member states should actually proceed according to what is being done in the European Economic Area article as a model of political exemption. Here the rule would be, if a member state wishes legislation not consistent with European law, then it would have to ask other member states whether they consider that it would hinder the functioning of the internal market. And if these member states say, no, it's okay for us, you can go ahead, they could go ahead. What he calls the convergent diverse interest model, or democratic legitimacy based on the consensus rule, defined as legitimacy in agreement, volenti non fiat injuria. Because other member states don't feel kind of hurt by what this individual member state is taking as a policy action. So this is something which is a way where, in a way, you could allow for more space for political action and initiatives and policy initiatives at the member state level without kind of harming the functioning of the European Union and the market and the European Union as it exists at the higher level. Now, for the bundling of forces, of course, you all know for the collective tasks, what has been discussed for a couple of years now is more own resources. And it has been pointed out again and again that the EC, the European Commission, has been dragging its feet in actually going forward on this roadmap and to take steps in order to create more own resources or to propose more own revenues for the European level. And, well, what you have seen, of course, where it has been successful is Next Generation EU, where you have this kind of common borrowing possibilities for common purposes. But the big question, of course, will be, will that re-extend it once it expires? Will we go for further kind of common borrowing possibilities, for instance, for common defense, just to give one example. Now, for bundling forces, of course, you need a narrative, right? And it has been discussed a lot by a lot of scholars that the Schicksalsgemeinschaft after the Second World War is still important for the older generation, right, as a function and of a deepening European Union. But many of maybe the younger generations are not so much aware of this need anymore. Now, another narrative, which of course we are now faced with since the Russian aggression of Ukraine, it would be, of course, defense against Russia could be a common narrative, but having a narrative which is only defensive and protective and is not that appealing, right? Of course, there is a necessity to react in that way, but it certainly can't be the narrative of the European Union for the future, with a positive prospect and a hopeful prospect for what the European Union shall be and should be. Therefore, I mean, you have been the answers also given by Zürn and Börzel in their big research project on individual human rights, liberal value script, which is, of course, very important. But since it is universal, of course, it's not specific to the European Union. Therefore, it has been added what needs to be added. It's not enough to have this kind of rights aspect, universal rights aspect, but it also has to be linked clearly to process kind of need of democratic processes, that is a value of democratic and collective self-determination in a democratic state, in a democratic polity. And of course, this perspective, which I mentioned, to have also a perspective of hope and social security, economic prosperity for all, and inclusiveness for the future. So that, in a way, for the discussion about the importance of narratives facilitating integration. Now, of course, the big challenge we are faced with, of course, given again, due to the situation, but also for a longer period of time already, and there was a certain fatigue, as we all have known and seen and discussed, of enlargement, but now that has changed, given the changed situation. And the question is, of course, how should this enlargement then be implemented? How should it happen? How should it go about? And there have been these proposals of this staged access of candidates, different targets of membership, but keeping it open and flexible, preserve the conditionality conditions, which would result probably in different types of membership, and the possible reversibility as well, which would amount to a differentiated enlargement step by step, as has been proposed, for instance, by this French-German report of the 12, and which we will see how it plays out in the future. In view of this kind of future enlargement, which calls for a need to stabilize and consolidate the periphery, and the task and the huge challenge of migration we are faced with, and the demographic challenge which we are facing, as we all know, investing in migrants under the condition that they recognize the political order of liberal democratic parliamentary democracies in member states, and the rule of law, of course, is crucial as kind of a condition of being able to become a member. And it may be, as I said, differentiate member states, which, by the way, may at one point also offer possibilities if the EU would become a more differentiated architecture. It would be more clumsy, even more clumsy as it is now, but it would also open opportunities, and myself as a Swiss citizen may think that even we as Switzerland would find some way of linking to the European Union in the differentiated union, or maybe the Brits may find one possible way of linking back into the architecture of a differentiated European Union. But given, this, as you said, changed geopolitical situation, of course, this means enormous challenge in the changing global order from bipolarity to multipolarity, in which the European Union hasn't defined its role yet, and war having come back to Europe. So this pressure for common defense, security, and foreign policy is very, very strong. And the question is indeed, can Europe here become an actor? Can it kind of contain centrifugal forces? Can it gain agency in foreign policy, in defense policy, beyond being what it is already now, kind of the champion of regulation, which is all now off markets? So what has been discussed is enhanced cooperation with willing member states, with centripetal effects on those willing to join. So there has been this kind of plan of having a core group of 5, which can then be joined by those who are willing, and with kind of 6 months kind of governance of one of these 5 with a prerogative, that is without a veto player. So this is being discussed as a possible solution, and those who are willing to join are welcome to join. But there are also, just to mention it as we speak, there are lots of co-projects going on, which kind of linked sovereignty or actions at the member state level and the European level, which have, or between member states in particular actions, which have been not very terribly salient and haven't kind of drawn much public attention, but they're ongoing, and I think one should observe also what's going on at this level. So to conclude, federalization in terms of a United States of Europe, I don't think that will happen anytime soon, but I think there will be smaller steps of deepening and differentiation, which are more likely and which are ongoing, and they will be incremental, but as you can observe along the last 2 decades or so, incrementalism can go a long way and change a lot. But what would be important, of course, to make sure that political participation in what's happening incrementally and what is being changed in step by step should be very clear to the democratic public, right? And they should be aware of what is happening. So balancing federalization to bundle forces if needed, and allowing for diversity and decentral initiatives if possible remains a continuous task, but I would think it should be considered a challenge, of course, but also an opportunity for the EU. Thanks for your attention.